It's not good for the speaker to eat just before he has to speak. So if I just lay down here and go to sleep at about halfway through the presentation, just kind of ignore that. I mentioned this morning that I'm a pilot and I normally fly a four-place airplane, a small four-place, called a Mooney. A lot of people want to know what a Mooney is. So let me show you what my airplane looks like. This is the one I flew into Regina last year and did the camp at Echo Lake. I was very privileged to have been picked up by some wonderful people and taken to their house and some lunch. You all probably know who that is. But my point is this is a very fast airplane, and it is great for getting across the country. It's a little bit too far to come here, especially this time of year with all the icing conditions that they have going on right now. So I left it at home, flew up here commercial yesterday. But in this particular talk, we're going to talk about fossils, Grand Canyon, and the global flood. And we need to do that because it is a very important topic. Somebody mentioned earlier today that some people are even beginning to teach in our churches that Noah's flood was not global at all, that it was a regional or a local flood. So we're going to address that a little bit in this particular session. You see, today, a lot of people are beginning to believe that we can put evolutionary humanism and all of its billions of years together with biblical creation and make the two fit with no problem at all. And I am going to be telling you, especially in the session tomorrow, the consequences of the path that you choose. You can't do that. That's like trying to put oil and water together. They do not mix. Oh, you can get them to mix if you put them in the same thing and shake it up. And as soon as you stop shaking for about a second and a half, they start settling out. You just can't get them to mix. And yet some Christians today believe that you can put the two of them together. Ironically, evolutionary humanists knew a long time ago that you can't put evolutionary humanism and biblical creation together. Look at this quote by Dr. Richard Bozarth. He says, "Christianity has fought, still fights, and will fight science to the desperate end over evolution because evolution destroys utterly and finally the very reason Jesus' earthly life was supposedly made necessary." He goes on. He says, "Destroy Adam and Eve in the original sin, and in the rubble you will find the sorry remains of the Son of God. Take away the meaning of his death. If Jesus was not the Redeemer that died for our sins, and this is what evolution means, then Christianity is nothing." Folks, this evolutionists knew and understood you cannot put the two together. And so in every topic that I deal with, and there's about 10 or 11 of them that I talk about regularly, I try to answer at least 4 of the major questions that kind of revolve around that particular topic. In this session, is evolution true science while creation is only special religion? We're going to talk about the fossil record. Is it evidence for evolution, and where did all those fossils come from anyway? We're going to talk about carbon and radiometric dating, and then we're going to answer the question, does it really matter if the biblical flood was local or global? Now, that first question, is evolution true science while creation is only religion? I'm only going to touch on briefly, and I'm going to actually really compress that particular question because I'm going to deal with that in detail tomorrow in the consequences of the path you choose. I believe it's 4 o'clock or something like that. Okay? Now, one of the things you'll hear me say in all of the different topics I talk about is simply this. The Bible really can be trusted, beginning with the very first verse of Genesis. Now, when you look at the Genesis record and the account of the flood, we see some things that are very different than what some of our churches are teaching today, and certainly very different than what they're teaching in the public, or I now call them the government education system down in the United States. Now, there's 2 different ways to look at every single piece of evidence. One way is through what we call man's theories. That particular worldview is looking through a magnifying glass. The other worldview is through the Holy Bible. And so depending on what pair of glasses you have on, what magnifying glass you're looking at the evidence with, it will determine the conclusion that you draw about that particular piece of evidence. And so we're going to look at the evidence for the flood and for Grand Canyon and so forth through a different pair of glasses. We're going to look through the biblical glasses this evening, and we're going to look at it within what Answers in Genesis calls the 7 C's of history. The perfect creation created by God, corrupted by Adam when he disobeyed God's single command, judged by God some 1,656 years later when God brought the worldwide global flood. Then the 4th C is the dispersion or the confusion, if you would, at Babel, dealing with the Tower of Babel event, and then the fact that the Creator himself, Jesus Christ, entered his creation, born of a virgin, a miracle, and then walked and talked with men, bringing in his new covenant and bringing in the new precepts. And finally, the Roman cross that Jesus Christ voluntarily went to and died on at a place and time of his own choosing. And finally, the 7th C, the coming consummation, the fact that he promised to come back to this world and restore it back to its original perfect state. Now go with me in Scripture if we can. I see that there's a little bit of a resolution difference here. I'm not exactly sure what it is, but I hope it won't cause us too much of a problem. 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 1. So I may try to change. If you have a Bible, turn with, well, you can go ahead and look here and we'll just read it together. But there were false prophets among the preacher, even as there shall be false teachers among you, who privately shall bring in damnable heresies, even denying the Lord that bought them, and bring upon themselves swift destruction. And many shall follow their pernicious ways, by reason of whom the way of truth shall be evil spoken of. Let me stop there for a second. Somebody earlier today talked about truth, did they not? What is truth? Truth is the Word of God. Jesus Christ is the Word. Jesus Christ is truth. He said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. But it says, by reason of whom the truth shall be evil spoken of. Let me apply that a little bit different tonight. Let me paraphrase it. They shall call the truth that God created the heavens and the earth a lie, and they will call the lie of evolutionary humanism to be the truth. In other words, this has happened through many, many different things in our society today, especially down there in the United States. But he goes on, verse 4, if God spared not the angels that sinned, but cast them down to hell and delivered them unto the chains of darkness, to be reserved unto judgment, and spared not the old world, but saved Noah, the 8th person. Now, there were 8 people on board the ark, but this is talking about Noah being the 8th in the line of patriarchs. Adam, Abel, Seth, and so forth. Noah was the 8th. It goes on. He says, Noah, a preacher of righteousness, bringing in the flood upon the world of the ungodly. And then we're going to drop to chapter 3, verse 3. He says, knowing this first, that in the last days there shall come scoffers walking after their lust, saying, where is the promise of his coming? For since the fathers fell asleep, all things continue as they were from the beginning of creation. In other words, everything appears to be happening exactly the same as it was from the beginning. That's what scientists today call uniformitarianism. What we see happening today is happening exactly the same as it was for millions of years into the eons of the past. Going on here, they willingly are ignorant of that by the word of God the heavens were of old, and the earth standing out of the water and in the water, whereby the world that then was, being overflowed with water, perished. By the way, that was great. You got that resolution just that quick. Thank you. So, what we're talking about here is essentially 2 different worldviews. They are going in opposite directions. You see, one worldview teaches that death, disease, bloodshed, and struggle is normal. Death is a normal part of life. Why? Because death causes upward evolutionary pressure. Death, disease, bloodshed, struggle, survival of the fittest, and so forth. That causes things to evolve into a constantly upward direction. The other worldview teaches something very different. You had it just a minute ago. I don't know what happened. The other worldview teaches something very different, that God created the heavens and the earth perfect. Man's sin brought death, disease, bloodshed into the world, and it has been going downward ever since. So we have two distinctly polar opposite world views. They're going in opposite direction, and I want to develop that completely tomorrow in the session that I mentioned then. Let me go ahead and work with you real quick here. Just leave that plugged in. There we go. And maybe we can make the resolution work good, because we've got some clips coming up here. All right, let's see what happens here. Still not quite right. You had it over there on that one there a minute ago. But he can mess with that a little bit if he'd like, and maybe he can get it. But so we want to move on to the second question at this particular time. Is the fossil record evidence for evolution? And where did all those fossils come from anyway? Now, you remember I showed you a clip this morning from one of those new type of media clips that Answers in Genesis is trying to put together for the young people. Let me show you another one here. This one is simply titled, What about the fossil record?
Now this one I've heard quite a bit. The fossil record speaks for itself and it proves evolution. Really? Well, first of all, evidence like the fossil record doesn't speak for itself. It's interpreted through a person's worldview, like looking through a lens. We all have the same evidence in the present, the same rock layers, the same fossils, etc., and we interpret this evidence in regard to the past through the lens or worldview we use. An evolutionist will interpret the evidence through the lens of what he's been taught about evolution in millions of years, but a biblical creationist will interpret the same fossils differently through the lens of the Bible. Now, both are looking at the same evidence in the present, but both are interpreting it very differently. So looking at the fossil record in the present, because that's all we have, and interpreting it through the lens of God's Word, we find that what we actually observe in the present confirms the interpretation obtained by looking through the lens of the Bible. Now, the only meaningful place to start is with the word of someone who has seen everything from the beginning and told us exactly what happened. That someone is God, who has given us a written account of the world's true history in the Bible. Genesis 1:1 says, "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth." Now, God's written word tells us that during creation week, God created different kinds of animals and plants according to their kinds. The implication is that they will produce after their kind. That's exactly what we see today, isn't it? An elephant produces an elephant, a dog produces a dog, and on and on. Now on the sixth day, man and woman, Adam and Eve, were also created, and God declared everything very good. It was complete and perfect, and there was no death because there was no sin. Later on in Genesis chapter 3, it is revealed that the man and woman, being tempted by the serpent, rebelled against God, broke his command, and sin and corruption entered the world. In fact, the entire creation was altered and is no longer in its originally perfect, very good state. People and animals began to die. But could gradual death in such a short period of time account for the fossil record we observe today? Not only that, to form a fossil, the animal or plant has to be covered quickly. And since we find billions of fossils all over the world today, something that could have killed billions of things rather quickly had to have occurred. Not to mention, we also find many fish and other marine fossils at the tops of today's mountains. So, what in the Bible could account for that? What could cause billions of dead things to be buried in rock layers rapidly laid down by water all over the earth? Well, flip to Genesis chapter 6 through 9 and you'll read the account of the global flood in Noah's day. Essentially what happened is that men were so corrupt and violent that God selected a righteous man, Noah, and his family to build a huge ark and get in it along with a pair of each land animal kind. And then God caused a worldwide flood. The water gushed up from the ground, and water fell from the sky. The earth was totally covered with water, and all land-dwelling, air-breathing creatures outside the ark were killed. All of them. It was a massive and destructive event. After more than a year, the waters had subsided enough that Noah and his family and the animals could get off the ark. Now, what would a worldwide flood do to the earth? Well, far too many things to discuss here, but it would have definitely totally changed the earth's terrain. It would have tossed things all around, and it would have destroyed billions of plants and animals, burying them all over the earth. So based on the biblical worldview, we know that God created everything and it was perfect. But because of man's rebellion, people became corrupt and all kinds of things began to suffer and die. Because of man's continual violence and corruption, God destroyed all people and all other land-dwelling, air-breathing creatures in the world, save Noah, his family, and representatives of all land-dwelling, air-breathing animal kinds, with a global, catastrophic deluge. The fossil record that we observe today makes perfect sense within the biblical worldview. Now I could go on, but enough said.
Enough said. That's also another one of those clips on that Check This Out DVD. But here's a simple question. When a scientist go out there and they dig up a fossil, when does the fossil exist? Fossils exist in the present. They don't come out of the ground when you dig them out with a nice little label around it saying, I died 65 million years ago. The fossil has to be brought out of the ground very carefully and then interpreted. So here's the problem. You see, today, we have evolutionists saying that over billions of years, that accounts for how everything got here. The Bible says something very different. You see, the Bible teaches that there are no transitional forms. Everything was formed fully functional right at the beginning. In other words, Adam was formed on day 6 of creation week. Was he formed as a little baby? No, he was a fully functional man right from the beginning. Now, he looked like he might have been 30 or 40 years of age, but he was only hours old. That's what we mean by fully formed and functional. On the other hand, evolution teaches that there should be millions of transitional forms evolving upwards because of the evolutionary process, evolving upwards into higher and higher, more complex life forms. Now, if that's true, if that actually happened, there should be millions or billions times billions of in-between transitional fossils, should there not? Well, I like to ask the question, where are these transitional fossils? I mean, if they really existed, maybe we would see something like a butter cat, or maybe we see something like a cat cow, or maybe even a catrilla. Maybe we would see something like a sparrow boxer, or a tiger owl. You know, aren't computers great? You know, you can get something to morph into anything else. I mean, they're just great. Do you know what? That's what they're teaching your kids and grandkids in the public education system. That one kind morphed into another kind over millions of years. I just did it real fast with a computer. But that's what they want you to believe. Folks, things don't evolve into other things. Dr. Duane Gish, one of the 2 founders of the Institute for Creation Research, likes to ask, where are all of the missing transitional forms? And by the way, Dr. Gish just went home to be with the Lord about a month ago. He was over 90. He was a trooper. He was one of the best debaters we've ever had. In fact, the last 6 or 7 years of his life, he couldn't get an evolutionist to debate him because he put him down with the evidence. He was a very, very diminutive man. He was short like Dr. Henry Morris was, but a giant intellectually. But anyway, he likes to ask, where are they? Well, I was going to point out the fact that I've traveled around the world and I actually found a missing transitional form, and I'm going to show you a picture of it. This appears to be in the process of evolving from an ox cart to a truck. Of course, you know, you got to let me have a little fun once in a while. I do this all the time. But seriously, take a look at this. This is called the geologic column. And they have all these things lined up real nice. They got the Cambrian, Ordovian, Silurian, Devonian, Mississippian. Of course, they never talk about the Cambrian explosion. The Cambrian explosion is a big problem for evolutionists. Why? Because in the Cambrian explosion, all of a sudden, boom, there's all of these millions of different kinds of life in the fossil record. Prior to that, there's nothing. They don't talk about that very much, do they? Why? Because they want you to believe everything evolved upwards. But do you know what's interesting about this geologic column? It's only found in one place, in high school and college science textbooks. Nowhere can you find it out there in the real world. You can find some of the layers here and hundreds of miles or thousands of miles away, find some more of the layers, but nowhere can you find that geologic column stacked up like that. Only one place. That is in the high school and college science textbooks. So when we move on and we talk about fossils, let's ask the question, how do fossils form? Well, in order for that to happen, first of all, the living organism has to die. Then it's got to be rapidly buried by mud and cut off from oxygen, or it's going to rot and decompose and stink. Then, if the right chemicals are present, they leach into the remain, replacing tissue and turning that tissue into stone. Now, how long does it take to form a fossil? Hundreds of thousands of years, millions of years? That's what they teach the students in the schools. No, it doesn't take that at all. It just takes the right conditions. And what in the world would form billions times billions of fossils? That's a huge event, folks. The Bible says it was a worldwide global flood. And that worldwide global flood covered the entire surface of the planet. You see, Noah's flood covered the whole earth, and the Bible clearly teaches that that was the case. Now here's something that's interesting. How many of you remember that tsunami that struck Japan just a couple years ago? Okay? Killed about 25,000 people, right? You remember that? Well, what was interesting is all around that coastal area where that tsunami swept in and killed those people, there's a whole series of these stones. Some of them over 600 years old. And here's what the stone slabs read. High dwellings of the peace and harmony of our descendants. Remember the calamity of the great tsunamis. Do not build any homes below this point. Do you know that every single home built below those stones was wiped out? Not a single home built above that row of stones was. Seems like if we forget history, we are doomed to repeat it. If we forget biblical history, we've got even a bigger problem, because we're talking about eternal questions in this particular case. Let me just talk about the flood. The flood was not a regional or local flood at all. It was global. Let me see if this clip will run. This is what we think it looked like when God said the fountains of the great deep broke open. We all remember the 40 days and 40 nights of rain. Where the real action was going on was the breaking open of the fountains of the great deep. You talk about a tsunami, we're talking about one here maybe 500 feet high, moving at 500 miles an hour, the speed of a jet aircraft. Folks, a tsunami that size would cover and wipe out the entire surface of the earth in less than 24 hours. The Bible says in the 600th year of Noah's life, the second month, the 17th day of the month, all of those fountains of the great deep were broke open. In one single day, God destroyed the earth. In fact, in Genesis chapter 7, he says, this is God talking, he says, even I, do bring a flood of waters upon the earth to destroy man with the earth, not from the earth, with the earth. It was a worldwide global flood. In fact, it was the second greatest catastrophe of all time. Of course, you all know what the first great catastrophe was, right? It was when Adam sinned and broke the world and brought that curse into the world because Adam had been given the dominion over it. Now today, we see remnants left over from that great catastrophic flood called Noah's flood. And when you go out to the American West, of course, you can see a lot of these places where there's been a massive erosional event, in fact, multiple erosional events, and you look at them, you can see them from different perspectives, of course, and I'm going to show you a few more in a minute. But here's a simple question I like to ask. If there really was a worldwide global flood like the Bible teaches, if it really did happen like that, what evidence would a scientist expect to find left over from a huge catastrophic event like that? I'll tell you what you'd expect to find. You would expect to find billions times billions of dead things. You'd expect to find them laid down by fast-moving water in a sedimentary rock layers. You'd expect to find them all over the earth. And guess what? That's exactly what they find. Billions of dead things buried in rock layers laid down by water all over the earth. And that's exactly what the fossil record is. It's not evidence of billions of years of slow, gradual evolution. It's evidence of a massive kill on a global scale. And that's exactly what God's stated intent for the flood was. So, Let's move on and we talk about the next section here for just a second, and that is the question about carbon or radiometric dating. Now, how many of you here, I always like to ask this question, how many of you here tonight have been made to feel less than intelligent because you don't understand radiometric or carbon-14 dating? Raise your hand. A lot of you. Me too. They do it to me all the time. Oh, you don't understand radiometric dating. I'm the one with the PhD. Just take my word for it. It's billions of years old. And what do? We take their word for it. Well, I'm here to tell you we don't have to take their word for anything. The only person we have to take his word for anything is Jesus Christ. He is the creator of the universe. He gave us the biblical record. He wrote it down one time, got it right. The first time he wrote it down, never had to change anything. Unlike what evolutionists have to do when they go back and rewrite the textbooks every couple of years when they make new discoveries. Now let me just talk about radio and carbon-14 dating for just a minute because it's important. Why? If radiometric dating is unreliable, then evolution's got a big problem. Why? Because they need billions of years for evolution to work its magic if it's going to have any chance at all. That's why this is such a foundational issue. And so if radiometric dating doesn't prove it's billions of years old, they have an entire house of cards that crumbles and becomes worthless. Carbon-14 dating was what they started talking about back in the 60s and early 70s when I first came back from Thailand as a missionary kid. And I remember them talking, oh, carbon-14 dating proves the world's millions of years old. How does carbon-14 work? Well, it's relatively simple. When something is alive and living, it constantly takes in carbon-14, the radioactive isotope of carbon. When it dies, it ceases taking in carbon-14, and the carbon-14 in the tree trunk, let's say when it dies, begins to decay. Carbon-14 has a relatively short half-life of about 5,500 years. And so 5,500 years after the tree dies, half of the carbon-14 that was in it when it died has decayed and only half is left. Everybody still with me? Okay. 5,500 years after that, half of that has decayed. Now there's only a quarter of the original amount left, and so forth, all right? So after about 20,000 years, the amount of carbon-14 would be so minute they could not detect it. Carbon-14 is not highly radioactive like some of the other isotopes, so it would be very hard to detect. Well, at 20,000 years after the death of the tree in this case. Well, it didn't take the evolutionists very long to realize they had a serious problem. They didn't need 20 or 30 or 50,000 years. They needed billions of years if evolution was going to work its magic. So what did they do? They stopped talking about carbon-14 30 years ago. And yet still today I hear people say carbon-14 proves the world's millions of years old. Folks, if you hear somebody say that, look them right in the eye and say they don't have a clue what they're talking about. Because even the evolutionists stopped talking about it years ago. So what did they do? They came out with radiometric dating. That's basically the same process, except this time they use radioactive isotopes that are highly radioactive, like potassium and uranium-238, the radioactive isotope of uranium. All right? So I'm going to give you a couple of slides up here for those of you taking notes, and I like using my little remote as an example for the rest of you to show the fallacy of radiometric dating. You see, let's say that my sample here has, well, let me get a little bit more specific here before we go on, because I don't want to lose anybody. First of all, radiometric is a dating method based upon the ratio of parent-to-daughter elements in radioactive decay chains. Secondly, it's used for the estimation of longer periods of times, like millions of years. Thirdly, it applies to igneous rocks from the time of their solidification. In other words, when the volcano erupts and the lava hardens, that starts the radiometric clock ticking. Finally, isotope concentrations can be measured very, very accurately today. Why? Because these radioactive isotopes are highly radioactive and much easier to measure and detect. So, in the case of uranium to lead, uranium is considered to be the parent element. When it decays, it does not disappear. It decays into lead, the daughter element. And so they measure how much uranium, how much lead, they calculate the half-life and then the ratio between the two, and they come up with the date. All right? Here are the 4 fallacies of radiometric dating. And it's quite amazing because they're unprovable assumptions. Assumption number one, say for a minute that I have found this sample buried way down here in a rock layer that evolutionists say is 1 billion years old. Problem number one, how could they possibly know how much uranium-238 was in the sample 1 billion years ago when it was buried? They can't know that. They can guess. How could they possibly know how much lead, the daughter element, was in this sample 1 billion years ago when it was buried? That's problem number two. They can't know that. They can guess. They can speculate, but they can't know. Thirdly, how could they possibly know that the entire 1 billion years that the sample laid there, waiting for me to find it, that no parent element or daughter element was leached into or out of the sample? In other words, it laid there for 1 billion years without being contaminated. Come on, folks. Scientists take great precautionary steps to make sure their samples are not contaminated when they're testing things. They want me to believe that thing laid there 1 billion years without being contaminated? We know better. And finally, number four, how could they possibly know that the entire 1 billion years that the sample laid there waiting for me to find it, that the radiometric decay rate has remained exactly the same, never speeded up or never slowed down? Could maybe something like a catastrophic flood change or modify the decay rate a little bit? You see, there's a whole lot of questions that they can't answer. So, radiometric dating is based on 4 unprovable assumptions. Now, I like to point out the fact that I don't have a problem with scientists making assumptions. They do that all the time. It's part of the scientific method, is it not? But don't teach it to our kids and young people as a fact. That's where I have the problem. And that's exactly what they do. Oh, it's a fact. We've proved the world's billions of years old using radiometric dating. No, they have not. As a matter of fact, the Institute for Creation Research did an 8-year research project called the RATE Project, Radioactive Isotopes and the Age of the Earth. And out of that 8-year research project came 2 things. One was a book, a technical book called Thousands Not Billions, and then secondly, they produced a DVD called Thousand Not Billions for the lay person like you and me. I don't know whether Brother Gary has any of those back there or not. If he doesn't, I'm sure he can probably get you one. It's a great DVD that shows the fallacy graphically with a lot of neat stuff for the average person like you or me can get a hold of it. But for the rest of the talk, I want to go out there to what we call the Grand Circle in the American West. They call it the Grand Circle because it comprises an area of 4 states, Utah, Colorado, Arizona, and New Mexico. And within that circle, there are 18 national parks and national monuments. And actually, there's a number of state parks as well. Candy and I have been privileged to have been to every one of these 18 national parks and national monuments and studied them, looked at them, took pictures, and did a lot of stuff, hiking in them and everything. Of course, we're going to go out and we're going to talk to the information on number 9 there, which is the Grand Canyon. The first time I went out there and started looking at Grand Canyon in a serious manner was in 1995 with a group of ICR scientists. And boy, what an eye-opening trip that was. As a matter of fact, here's the group that I was with: Dr. John Morris, the president of ICR, Dr. Ken Cummings, PhD in biology from Harvard, Dr. Kurt Wise, Dr. Steve Austin, a PhD in geology from University of Pennsylvania, and Larry Vardaman, Hannah Rush, who's a archaeologist. I mean, it was what a trip, and learning the whole time. Well, what evolutionary humanists want you to believe is that it took the Colorado River millions of years to erode and downcut the canyon. And no matter where you go out there to the Grand Canyon, you find placards and you find rangers giving tours and everything and talking about the millions of years that the canyon was carved by the Colorado River. Now, like I said, Candy and I have rafted down it a couple times. We've hiked into it multiple times from both the north and the south rim. We've flown over it in a small airplane a number of times in both the Hawk XP, which what these pictures are taken from, and also out of that Mooney that I showed you a picture of. Now, what's interesting is you can choose a number of ways to go into the canyon. Of course, hiking is one. I mean, I love doing the hiking, but you can go down there another way. You can go down on mules. Anybody been down to the canyon on mules? Anybody ridden canyon? Well, they've never lost anybody on one of these mule rides. They've had people get off the mule, stand too close to the edge and go over, but never had the mule go over with somebody on them. And I like to point out that they train those mules in East Tennessee. All of them. Anyway, so much for that. But a number of years ago, and multiple times, I have been to both the north and the south rim of the canyon. But it had been about 10 years or so since I had been to the south rim of the canyon. And just last year, Candy and I went to the canyon. And we stayed a couple of days at the south rim. And we decided to walk the south rim trail. By the way, this is Phantom Ranch down in the bottom of the canyon, right here. And so we walked over, we took the shuttle bus, went to the visitor center, and then walked to the rim of the canyon. Now, I'm kind of lost because it had been 10 years since I've been. They had a brand new visitor center. They had trails and parking lots and stuff that I hadn't seen before because it had been about 10 years. So anyway, we got to the rim, and as we walked up to the rim right there, here is this plaque. It says, the Rim Trail. I said, oh boy. And I looked to the left towards the west, and it's all paved. It used to be just gravel. I thought, wow, they've spent some money here. And so we started walking to the west. And here I see another plaque. It says, this bronze meter represents the last 1,000,000 years. Walk this way to feel how long 2,000 million, in other words, 2 billion years in history is. One long step is 1 million years back in history. So now I'm starting to have a little problem. You know, I don't like this already. Well, as we walk, here we see a nice, beautiful medallion about the size of a 1 gallon paint gallon. If I can get it out right, 1 gallon paint can. There we go. You know, and it says 100 million years ago, a geology timeline. And we keep walking, and pretty soon here's another one, 160 million years ago. We're going back in time. And as we walked a little further, here I see a nice, beautiful plaque, another one. The top layer is 270 million years old. And now I'm starting to have a real problem with this, okay? And as I walk further, here's a nice, beautiful pedestal, Grand Canyon Supergroup. And here's a piece of rock that they went down in the canyon that they say is down at a layer that is 780 million years old, cut a piece of it, polished it, brought it up here, and set it on this trail backwards in time. And we go some more steps, and pretty soon here's another one. Grand Canyon Supergroup, the Kade Sandstone, 1,180 million years old, from down even deeper in the canyon. And as we go on, here's 1,600 million, in other words, 1.6 billion years ago. And then I keep going, and pretty soon here's something that's really old. Of course, I have to have a little bit of fun. But seriously, we go a little bit further. Now this one's the Horn Creek Granite, even deeper in the canyon. And then we come to another beautiful plaque. Vishnu Rocks. These are near the canyon bottom. The basement rocks formed 1,750 million years ago to 1,660 million years ago. This is the bottom of the canyon. And then you keep on walking. Here's another plaque. Imagine. Now we're going from science to imagination, right? I mean, up to that point, they wanted us to believe it was science. Well, of course, all of that was imagination too. But at least this plaque, imagine. So now we've gone into the area of imagination. And then, of course, you go a little further, and this one really gets me. 1.2 billion years is missing. How does 1.2 billion years go missing? Where did it go? Folks, I am really upset by this point because they spent millions of taxpayer dollars that we borrowed 40 or 50 cents from the Chinese to do all of this stuff, you know? It gets, well, anyway. Finally, we get to the far end of this trail of time. I passed the El Tovar Lodge and way around getting towards the west. Here's the final plaque. 4,560 million years ago was when the earth was formed. And I stood there, I smoke coming out of my ears, you know, I'm really upset about it. And finally it dawned on me, you know what? they have a problem with the zeros. There's too many zeros on the number. That's what the problem is. Let's erase a bunch of these zeros. Let's block that out, and let's read that 4,560 million years ago. No. How about 4,560 years ago? There was a worldwide global flood called Noah's flood. That fits almost perfectly with the biblical timeline if you get rid of all the zeros. And what really gets me is these scientists, these geologists, these PhDs, they teach this stuff the millions and billions of years like it's a fact, but sometimes they say it and they kind of roll their eyes. They can't even believe they're saying it and believe their own rhetoric. Listen to this clip.
Or near the rim were 270 million years old. But now that we're at the bottom, these rocks are much, much older than that.
Well, we're here. This is deep time. This is as deep as you can go in Grand Canyon and as far back in time as you can go in Grand Canyon. This is an amazing place. We're in what's called the Inner Gorge, and we have come back in time 1.7 billion years. 1.7 billion.
The plates in the Earth's crust collided here, and the resulting heat and pressure formed all the rocks we see.
You find the most amazing patterns in this rock because as the granite was squeezing up and beginning to solidify into solid rock, it was also being twisted and metamorphosed at the same time.
All this hard granite has been exposed by the softest of the elements, water.
And I think what's one of the neatest things for me is that this little tiny creek carved all the way through this canyon, all the way down through all of this hard rock, 5,000 feet of rock, to lay bare the heart of the earth here.
This little tiny creek carved all the way down through 5,000 feet of hard rock to expose. Do you get the irony of that? I mean, this is incredible. They teach this stuff as truth. Let me offer a different explanation for the formation of Grand Canyon. And when I was on that trip in 1995 with Drs. Austin and Dr. Morris, both PhDs in geology from the Institute for Creation Research, I finally heard the first explanation that makes sense. And here, the two of them are standing just east of Desert View, where that watchtower is on the south rim, looking across at the north rim, talking about the breach dam theory. If you stand there and you look across the rim, at the north rim, you can see visibly, you can see the layers warped up right here. This is where the North Rim Lodge is, right over here. And if you look way off in the background, this light layer way back here, where you're standing, if you watch and look at that layer, you can look at it. It comes all the way back around to where you're standing. It is the rim of a massive lake. Now they call it Lake Hopi. Has a name. This lake is 75, 80 miles across and thousands of feet deep. And what Dr. Morris and Dr. Austin are discussing is the idea that when the waters returned off the earth continually, like the scripture says at the end of Noah's flood, that water was caught back in a massive lake, and this right here was filled in at that time with what we call an earthen dam, like a pond dam. And as the water drained to the west, which is this direction here, that it exposed the soft, wet side of this Kaibab upwarp. As the water continued to lower into the Pacific Ocean, the soft, wet side of this Kaibab upwarp would begin to seep. The seep would turn into a trickle. And then suddenly there would be a massive breach, rushing water through there and literally carve the Grand Canyon in a matter of hours or days. We're talking about a lake that's thousands of feet deep, 75 to 80 miles across. That is a lot of water. And so when you look at this shot from a satellite, the snow line tells it all. I mean, you can see the plausibility of what they're talking about. Where we were standing is right here where Desert View is. Okay, this is the North Rim Lodge. This is the rim of Lake Hopi. and it comes all the way back around right here and then comes to right here. This is all a massive lake. And that lake, when that upwarp breached, that earthen dam breached, it literally rushed all that water out and carved that in a matter of days. Perfectly logical explanation. Now, I've been out there many times, and I never noticed it for the longest time until flying out there with the Hawk XP. Here we happen to be flying right over the Glen Canyon Dam. Some of you may have been out there. But the Glen Canyon Dam from here to here is over 1,000 feet. So the sheer walls of Marble Canyon here are 1,000 feet deep. Marble Canyon is actually cut into the bottom of Lake Hopi. This is the bottom of Lake Hopi here, thousands of feet below the rim of that big lake. This is another 1,000 plus feet below that, which indicates another breach up above. I don't have time to talk about that tonight. Be happy to talk with some of you individually about that. But as we flew south in this XP, this high-wing aircraft, towards Winslow, Arizona, where we landed, fueled, and then I already told you about what we saw happen over the meteor crater. Right? We're flying south. As I looked out under the right wing, which would be to the west, towards the breach of Grand Canyon, we saw something I'd never seen before. Do you see that? Massive erosional lines, like a whole massive sheet of water rushing right this direction towards the breach in the Grand Canyon right there. Further evidence of all of this water rushing and going right out that breach that Dr. Austin and Dr. Morris were talking about. Much better explanation than millions of years of erosion by the Colorado River. All of that little bitty creek over all those years cut that open and laid open the pit of the earth. Folks, look at this here. Do the evolutionists believe a worldwide global flood could happen on Earth? No. I mean, take a look at this quote here from the paper from the A&P. Waters roaring out of an overfilled lake carved an instant Grand Canyon, a valley more than a mile deep on the surface of Mars some 3.5 billion years ago. Look over here on the right. A ridge on the edge of that crater gave way, releasing a flood that carved this massive valley. Unlike Arizona's Grand Canyon, which was carved over millions of years by the Colorado River. This one on Mars happened in a matter of months, certainly less than a year. What are they saying? Now, the original flood was a Martian flood. I mean, look at some of these quotes off the net that I picked up. Martian, water world. As magma swelled upward, it drove water out of a basin nearly the size of the United States. Epic floods resulted, according to research. What kind of research is this guy doing? Evidence that suggests Mars was once a water-rich world is mounting as scientists scrutinize data from the Mars exploration rover. That information may well be leading to a biological bombshell of a finding that the red planet has been and could well be now the home for extraterrestrial life. In other words, it was E.T.'s flood or something like that. Here's a question of logic, folks. How much liquid water has been found on Mars? The answer is none, right? 3/4 of the earth is covered with water, some of it 7 miles deep. Do evolutionists believe that a worldwide global flood could occur on Earth? The answer is no. And the second question is, why not? You see, if you were to smooth the Earth's surface out like a billiard ball, like a cue ball, the Earth would be covered with water some 1.7 miles deep. Folks, I like to give people graphic pictures to try to help them understand, because that's the way my mind works. I like visual pictures. I want you to visualize just for a second that you're standing there right where India and Bangladesh come together in the ocean, and you've got a giant machete in your hand, and you put that machete right there at sea level, and then you magically cut, keeping it flat, right under Mount Everest. And then you pick up Mount Everest, turn it upside down, take a step or two over to the Mariana Trench off the Philippines, and push Mount Everest down into the Mariana Trench. When you finally get done pushing Mount Everest all the way to the bottom of the trench, the bottom of Everest will be 5,000 feet below the surface of the ocean. People ask the question, where did all the water go from Noah's flood? It went into the ocean basins, folks. There's huge ocean basins out there. uplifting, collapsing in the crust, when all of the water vacated with the breaking of the fountains of the great deep, the crust collapsed into those places. In other words, you have almost a turning inside out of the earth's crust. So, what about that last question? Does it really matter if the biblical flood was global or local? Yeah, it does. Do you know why? Because what you really have is you have a scientist saying, the earth is 1 billion years old. I'm the guy with the PhD. Take my word for it. On the other hand, you've got God saying in his inspired word, I created it in 6 days. Take my word for it. Why is that significant? It's significant because you have to take somebody's word for it. Nobody alive today was there when that thing happened. So you have to take somebody's word for it, don't you? I submit to you, we're a whole lot better off to take the word of an eyewitness. Who was the eyewitness? God was there. You see, today they want you to think the past is the key to the present. No, the past is not the key to the present. Revelation is the key to the past. The present is not the key to the past. In other words, the two are disconnected. We weren't there. We live in the day today. Noah's flood was a worldwide, global flood. But I like what he said earlier today. I have no problem with secular humanists who don't believe in God, don't believe the Bible, saying anything they want. What I have a problem with is people who claim to be born-again Christians that understand the Bible, saying that it was a regional or a local flood. Have you ever wondered what a local flood would look like? I mean, all the animals would have had to run and get out of the way, right? Certainly the people would have had enough sense to build a raft or a barge or something and get on it. Now, quickly, I want to ask another question, because I have people do this all the time. Okay, you've been talking about this. You're talking from the Bible, and all that's fine, but I don't buy the Bible. I don't believe the Bible. Are there any archaeological or historical records about the global flood other than the Bible? And the answer to that is yes, there are. For instance, from archaeology, there is a number of things emerging now that are absolutely stunning. 33 separate tablets have been discovered of a gigantic flood. 30 of those tablets mention an ark. Not only that, 28 of them mention an ark that came to rest on top of a mountain. 29 of those tablets, state that birds were sent out. 30 of them mention special favor or grace for the survivors. And most of the 33 tablets mention an act of worship as the survivors left the ark. This is stuff other than the Bible. Anything else? Yeah, there's the Well-Blundell prison. Found in 1923 in Lower Mesopotamia. It was written about 100 years before Abraham. The record begins with 8 kings who ruled before the flood, and at the end of that list of kings, it says that a flood swept over the entire earth. Not only that, on the Well-Blundell prison, it talks about record genealogies, records that parallel Genesis 5 and 11, long lifespans are inscribed on these prisms. Again, extra biblical. And how about this one here? The Ebla tablets. Boy, these things really knocked the socks off the evolutionists when they found these. 17,000 clay tablets discovered in northern Syria. Documents written on these clay tablets date around 2400 BC. That's just a few years after the flood of Noah, folks. They contain a creation account and a flood account, and these tablets mention Sodom and Gomorrah. I can tell you, the number of times other creations got laughed at. Oh, you talk about the Bible being a historical book, it's full of errors. No, it's not. Yeah, it is. It talks about Sodom and Gomorrah. So they're mythical cities. They're only found mentioned in the Bible. That shows right there the Bible's got an error. And then they found these tablets, and there really was a Sodom and Gomorrah. And that happens over and over again. Folks, there's a lot of good books that we have. One of the ones I like to recommend is How Do We Know the Bible's True? I don't know whether Brother Gary has any of those or not, but he's got 2 really great books back there. This one is Dr. John Morris, the president of ICR's newest book called The Global Flood. you might want to take a look at that. It would be a great addition to a homeschool curriculum or working with homeschoolers. This one here is Frank Sherwin and John Morris's book on fossils, the fossil record. Frank Sherwin's been with me twice down to the country of Trinidad and once to Peru working with our missionaries down there. Both of them are brand new books that deal with this subject of fossils, Grand Canyon, and the global flood. Don't forget about the fact that I've got the 8 different DVDs I do back there. One of them, of course, is the one that I just did, only a much longer version where I wasn't limited by time. I could go on here. Y'all ought to yell at him. He should have given me... No, I'm just kidding. Yeah, I got 2 more... a couple more minutes. But that 8 DVD set, all 8 of them are available. That set comes with 2 free DVDs. One of them is called The Grand Circle at 1,000 Feet, and the other one is A Question of Origin. So if you buy the 8 DVD set from Candy, don't forget to ask her for those free DVDs as well. That 8 DVDs, I'm sorry, The Grand Circle at 1,000 Feet, some of you that heard me at camp last year have these, so you know what I'm talking about. But there's a lot of pictures taken from a small 4-place airplane of places like Arches National Park, Grand Canyon, Monument Valley, Canyon de Chelly, Canyonlands, Mesa Verde, so forth. What it looks like from up above, looking down on this stuff. One of the cuts on that free DVD is the one I'm going to finish with right here, and then when it's over, you can have it back, Mr. Ted. But this young man asked the question, how can you say that there is no God?
Gazing at a bird in flight, soaring through the air, lying down beneath the stars. I feel your presence there. I love to stand at ocean shore and feel the thundering breakers roar. Fields of grain, neath endless blue, horizons listening to a river run, watering the earth, fragrance of a rose in bloom, a newborn's cry at birth. How could I say there is no